Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Now in this video, I'm going to do three things. First of all, we're going to talk about what an oil separator is, also known as a catch can. Number two, we're going to talk about what the benefits are of this device. And then number three, I'm going to give you an opinion as to whether or not I think this is a good device or worth your time to install on your truck. Also in this video, I'm going to show you how I installed one of these units in my F-150 PowerBoost and what kind of results that I got after a couple of months. Let's get into it. And we are going to start by defining what an oil separator is, also known as a catch can. Now again, I am just a shade tree mechanic. I am not an automotive expert, so I'm going to define things like positive crankcase ventilation to the extent of my abilities and my knowledge. If you want some additional information, I've included some excellent links of some other videos in the description below. Now we need to first start by defining what the problem is that we're trying to solve with this device. This is a little animation of a V engine, right? So this could be a V twin, this could be a V4, V6, V8, doesn't really matter. We're just looking at a cross section of this. Now I'm going to stop the animation for a second, even though I could sit there and watch that all day long, to define what the problem is. So here is the combustion chamber. Here is the top of the piston. Here is the cylinder walls. This is where the combustion is taking place. So up here on that side and that cylinder, and over here on this cylinder. All right, so this is where all the heavy stuff happens. This is where the spark happens. This is where the explosion is. And normally what you want is you want that explosion and all the gases to come out of the exhaust through the exhaust valve. And same thing over here. You want this explosion, all those gases to push down on this cylinder, and then the valve opens up and all the exhaust comes out into the header. Well, that's the idea. However, there is a little bit of what's called blow-by, which goes past the rings, past the cylinder, and down into the crankcase area. Here we go, positive crankcase ventilation. Now it starts to make sense. So what happens is this crankcase starts to get really hostile. Not only is it hot in there, but it's also getting blow-by in there, and it can start to pressurize. And that is a bad, bad thing. Now in the old days, they would just vent this onto the ground. They just didn't care. And you'd have all kinds of mixture of oily mess and hydrocarbons just sort of flying out of there. And that's all we knew back in the day. But around the, I want to say late 60s or early 70s, they started to institute positive crankcase ventilation. And so what they did was they tapped off the crankcase, and what they decided to do was to route it into the intake manifold. And so what's happening is this unburned gas and all these hydrocarbons are being routed back into the intake manifold to be combusted once again. Now that all works pretty well because you're solving two problems at once, because not only are you venting the crankcase, preventing, buildup of dangerous gases in here, but what you're also doing is you're reburning anything that could be burned back into the intake manifold. Okay, so that's my 5,000 foot explanation of that. But now what we have is an issue with what's called injection. So now we need to move to a different diagram and explain direct injection versus port injection. Now we have a different view of the engine. We can see the intake valves here. Here's the exhaust valves. Here's the cylinder or the combustion chamber in here. And these two items that are circled in yellow are injectors. These are fuel injectors. And you can tell just by looking at this, this is a direct injection because it directly injects gas right into the cylinder. And that's great, but as we'll see in a minute, that does cause a problem when we start using PCV. Now this second yellow circle is a port injector. So it's injecting gas into the actual intake port here before it hits the valve. And I believe from what I understand that Ford started adding these around 2017. So they had the multi-port, so they had the port and direct injection. Now remember that breather hose that we talked about coming from the crankcase and dumping hydrocarbons, oil, and everything else that came from the blow-by into the crankcase? Well, that gets dumped into the intake manifold, and that comes in through the port. And so the problem with direct injected engines only is all of that junk would get slammed into the back of the intake valve and would actually start to coke up. So now let's look at the back of some of these intake valves from different multi-port. So these are multi-port where we did have that port injection as well as the direct injection. And then these are direct injection valves where all of that junk is dumped right into the back of the intake valve. You can see the difference. These are all coked up. These are just a mess and they don't seal very well, and they will affect compression as well as efficiency of the engine. While these are relatively clean because that port injection is continually bathing the back of the valves. So even though we are dumping all of that toxic hydrocarbon and blow-by into the back of the valves with a PCV, the multi-port injection handles this a lot better. Okay, so how does this all relate to an oil separator? So the whole idea behind an oil separator is you're going to take a line. This is the PCV, the positive crankcase ventilation line, which normally is going to go straight back into the intake manifold in most engines. And what we're going to do is we're going to run it through a catch can first. The vapors come into this, they will actually collect and settle inside of the catch can before they get a chance to get into your intake manifold. So the only thing that really hits your intake manifold from the PCV are just vapors and not a bunch of oily gunk coming from your crankcase. So in theory, this is going to keep your valves a lot cleaner and you're going to have a lot less maintenance problems with your intake. All right, now that we know the background on what an oil separator is and what a catch can is used for, let's show the installation on a Ford 3.5 liter PowerBoost engine. Now this specific installation is going to be for a J&L oil separator 3.0 kit for a 2022 Ford 3.5 liter PowerBoost engine. This installation is slightly different from other Ford installations due to the fact that there's all the hybrid components that are blocking on the passenger side of the engine. To begin with, I've set aside the tools for the job. Really all you need is a 10mm socket wrench and a Phillips screwdriver. And then here is the oil separator itself, and there's the bracket in the plastic bag to be put on. It's just a can and a couple of hoses. That's all there is to the kit. It's very simple. Now, assuming that you can find your missing 10mm socket, the first thing to do is to remove a couple of nuts that are holding on the plastic engine cover. The next thing to do here is to remove the 10mm nut on this bracket just above the brake booster. Don't drop the nut. Now what we're going to do is we're going to install this mounting plate with Phillips screws on top of the catch can. The catch can gets reattached with that 10mm nut that we just took off a couple of minutes ago. Again, don't drop that nut. It doesn't need to be torqued all that tight. Our next task is to remove the existing PCV hose, and that's going to be on the passenger side of the engine. It's a hose about a foot long, as you can see here. The next thing that we need to do is to route the hoses from the catch can through the back of the engine and plug them into their respective ports. It's important that you route the catch can hoses underneath these big black hoses, the ones with the braids on them, as I'm showing here. The only thing left to do to finish off the job is to reinstall the engine cover using those two 10mm nuts that we did not drop into the engine. Now that we've got it installed, let's see how much residue that we can get from the catch can. When I checked at 500 miles, there was nothing in the catch can at all. I was wondering if it was even working, and there was hardly anything at 1,000 miles as well. This was during the heat of the summer. But in the fall, with cooler mornings, there is enough condensation from the crankcase to throw off some residue in the catch can. Let's check it out. So to check your catch can, all you have to do is to reach in and unscrew it. Now, this is a billet cap with very fine threads. It takes a while to unscrew this thing. I would just make it a habit to check about every 1,000 miles or so. Now, the first time I did this, as I'm showing here, I wasn't quite sure what to expect or how much was going to be in this catch can. Now, if you've been wondering why you've been holding on to that beaker from chemistry class for the past 30 years, here's your answer. Okay, so finally we're getting a chance to look at what came out of my crankcase and was not deposited into my intake manifold. So mostly it looks like oil, although as we look at this in a minute, there's all kinds of stuff in there. I always want to make a point to put the cap on before I forget. I don't want to leave it under the hood and find it rattling down the road. All right, let's take a look at what we harvested. It looks like mostly oil with some water in there, some sludge. I guess the question is, would you want this in your intake manifold? In my case, no. Now at this point, you might be wondering, should I install one on my truck as well? As we showed earlier in the video, those that have port injection, in addition to the direct injection, will not suffer the same valve coking as what you're going to find with direct injected engines only. This means that the oil separator is optional for engines having port injection. However, I'm taking the advice of senior Ford techs who publish on YouTube that recommend that it's a good idea to eliminate as much crankcase byproduct as possible from your intake manifold. And I've got additional videos in the description below that speak directly to this point. Therefore, I think it's a good idea, regardless of your engine, especially if you intend to keep your truck for a long time with extended mileage. It's a good idea to put on an oil separator. Now, who makes these oil separators? How can you get a catch can on your truck as well too? Well, I bought the J&L, which is a brand, J&L Oil Separator Company, and I bought it on Amazon. So follow the link in the video description for the same one as mine if you have a PowerBoost, or if you don't, make sure that you order the one specific to your truck or engine. You can hit their website and you'll get the right model number from that. Hey, if you made it this far, thanks for watching this video. Now, I get all my ideas for these videos from comments from users just like yourself. So if there's something that you'd like to see, or if there's any questions that you have for me, let me know in the comments below. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.